Okay, we're going to make a start. Hello, everybody, including the panel. We're going to make a start. And just a reminder for panelists to speak into the microphone because we have an online audience as well, and they won't be able to hear us unless we do that. So, to everyone here in person and online, welcome. My name is Tara Garnett. I'm director of Table, and it gives me enormous pleasure to see you at this event where the substance of this event is really a conversation inspired and prompted by a recent explainer that we produced, which explored the question of how best should we value nature in our food systems. Before I hand over to Henry, who will talk a little bit more about this, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about, introduce the panelists and tell you a little bit about Table. So for those of you who don't know, Table is a project based at the University of Oxford with partners in other universities around the world. We explore the values, evidence, and assumption that people bring to their discussions about food, about its future, and about what we want and what we fear for the food system. So we're really trying to explore the intersection between values and evidence. And this is obviously incredibly pertinent to this afternoon's discussion. So I'm joined on a panel today by, on my right, I have Vasilis, and my piece of paper is lost here, Vasilis Goumas from WWF. Vasilis leads WWF UK's work stream on the nature positive economy and sectoral transitions. On my left is my colleague Connie McDermott, who is an associate professor and Jackson Senior Fellow at Oriel College here at Oxford and of the Environmental Change Institute. And then further along is Rohit Koshish, who's the Chief Economic Advisor at the National Farmers Union, who oversees a team of economists, statisticians, and rural experts to develop and communicate the economic policy of the NFU. And then finally is Henry Levison Gower, who is the author of this explainer and founder and CEO of Promoting Economic Pluralism and director of the New Economics Knowledge Services, its consultancy arm. So I think that's enough from me for now. The format of this afternoon is that Henry is going to give a brief summary of what was explored while he was writing that explainer, and then we'll open out to a panel discussion, which is going to be very, very free-flowing. I'm going to take a back seat here. And then about half an hour, and then we'll give Henry a chance to kind of reflect and respond on what that discussion had to say about the themes raised. And then we're going to open up to a Q&A, both from you and from the online audience, and then we'll aim to close at 5:30. So that's enough from me, and over to Henry.
Thank you very much, Tara. Good afternoon. Firstly, I have to acknowledge that I do work part-time for DEFRA, but nothing I say should be taken as reflecting a DEFRA position, and these are not issues that I work on in DEFRA. I'm not officially an economist in DEFRA. So that's just to get that out the way. Anyone who's had a go at reading this might have noticed it's quite long, over 10,000 words, but it is actually trying to cover a huge amount. And obviously you can read books and books and books in this area. So I've been given 5 to 10 minutes to try and summarize it, which will mean it's going to be very much a sort of flyover the many issues. But I will try and do my best. So just to start then, the report has 4 characters, and they are sort of stereotypes, but I think reflect sort of reasonable perspectives, different perspectives in this area, though probably people might think, well, I'm a bit of that and a bit of the other, possibly. But hopefully are helpful in terms of providing different points of a very complex debate. So the first sort of on my left, if you like, the environmental economists and the environmental pragmatists. Now, environmental economics is actually part of neoclassical economics, which is often just referred to as economics because it is so dominant in terms of teaching, research, etc., etc. And a lot of people may have studied economics or read economics and think that's just economics. But no, neoclassical economics is a particular school of economics that I suppose is characterized by the use of mathematics and various simplifications to make it tractable, to be able to build models and make it more, as it's seen, scientific. So people will probably be quite familiar with the idea of homo economicus, the sort of agent that is trying to maximize their welfare in markets of supply and demand, and those sort of classic crosshairs of supply and demand where the market reaches equilibrium. And so in that model, obviously there's a simplification of people, there's a simplification of how people interact in markets, and so on. But that is that within that sort of broad idea, environmental economics is a subbit which tries to fit the environment into that broader framework. Environmental pragmatists are seen as people who are not necessarily economists, but probably know a bit about it, but see it as, if you like, the language of power. And which it is, it could be argued it is, because obviously all the departments in government have their economists. The Green Book in the UK sets out rules for assessing every policy in this framework. And internationally, this has spread from the US, from the UK into the EU and into international organizations and so on. So those are that is what you will meet most of the time in policy circles, in international organizations, in academia, when you study economics, if you do, as the sort of mainstream, if you like. Then I've introduced two other characters, if you like, or ways of seeing things. One is ecological economics. Now, ecological economics is a much more tricky one to sort of boil down into a single perspective, because some environmental pragmatists might call themselves ecological economics. And I suppose what I've taken, and this is from a sort of literature of people who've looked at this, is what marks out ecological economists, in my sense of the word, in this report, is that they go outside. I mean, they don't probably use the environmental economics framework. So they're drawing on a range of other traditions that have a long history as well of economics, such as institutional economics, Keynesian economics, complexity economics, things that you probably don't study. And there are quite a lot of differences between this strand. Feminist economics is one maybe people might be more familiar with, but I would say for the purposes of the discussion, maybe the biggest difference is that the ecological economists, in my meaning, are really interested in institutions. And here I mean institutions in a wide technical sense. So in this sense, saying please and thank you is an institution. They're also known as social norms or culture. A lot of these informal institutions, which we take for granted in every day and shape what we do. Also, formal institutions, which are legally set up, organizations, regulation, etc., etc. And this means that, I suppose, one of the big differences is in neoclassical environmental economics, the focus is sort of what's called methodological individualism. It starts with an agent and builds out a single agent. And the agent is the sort of driver in maximizing their utility of everything else, in theory. Outside that, in ecological economics, the institutions are the key, which obviously interact with individuals, but you're looking at the structures And therefore, it's ecological economics is also really interested in power and how that affects outcomes, how that defines what counts as knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. Then environmental justice organizations, I've sort of added to that people who maybe particularly come from the global south, where actually being an environmental activist might mean that you can be murdered, jailed, and so on, and where you see the huge power differentials between people trying to protect the environment and the global north, corporations, et cetera, et cetera. So that gives them a take where that sort of justice, green colonialism is absolutely at the front. I'm carrying on. I'm trying to give an overview to sort of get you into it, because there's a lot of detail here, but we won't really probably get into a lot of the detail. But if we then go into environmental economics and start talking about valuation. So within that economic tradition, the big focus is turning the environment into monetary units. So it can be compared with other possibilities. Trade-offs are central to environmental economics. Should we do this with this environmental damage and this economic loss, or this versus doing something else? So a lot of the techniques which are described are about how this is done, through surveys, through asking people what they're willing to, how they value. So it goes back to the individual. If I'm maximizing my utility, do I prefer a fish to a car, for instance? And environmental pragmatists tend to support that, because that's what you have to do in an impact assessment in policy developments around the world and when looking at projects, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas ecological economists see that, I think, at the broadest level, or a process of shoehorning a much broader canvas of values, views, how we see things, of power differentials, of different voices, different ways of talking, into a very narrow framework, and therefore losing a lot. So, for instance, neoclassical economics is based on marginal change. That's the idea of everything else being equal. In markets, the equilibrium, it's based on where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's very technical, but it works in a situation where you can ignore most of things because of the simplifications. And actually, if you look at the famous UK Green Book, it specifically says that if you're, for instance, thinking about large-scale infrastructure, there's a whole annex to the Green Book that says basically most of the assumptions, most of the simplifications don't work, because you've got lots of different things happening. So all these techniques that are standard to environmental economics, neoclassical economics, are sort of thrown out the window, because too many things, too much change is happening, and you can't really validly use the assumptions. And you can see that maybe in the environment, when you're radically changing things, fall into that camp as well. There's also another sort of basic thing, willingness to accept versus willingness to pay. And this is two approaches. If you ask someone how much they value something, how much are they willing to accept for its loss? So you live by a lovely woodland and you're asked, well, we're going to develop this. How much can we compensate you for its loss? Versus someone saying, I'm willing to build, create a new beautiful woodland, new park, etc. How much are you willing to pay? Now, actually, in fact, people respond to these questions very differently. People see a loss as a much bigger deal than a gain of something they haven't got. So depending on which way you ask the question, you can get a sort of multiple of 10 in terms of the different answer. And this has come out of behavioral economics as well. It's a sort of standard thing, loss matters. And actually, because it's easier, more tractable, etc., valuations tend to use how much you're willing to pay, not how much are you willing to accept for loss. So again, that's, when you're forced to get an answer, produce some money, you've got to sort of get rid of some of these complexities. And ultimately, ecological economics see it self-defeating. Basically, the problem is the economy driving destruction, and you're trying to put the environment into the enemy's conceptual framework, basically, in simple terms. The alternative they see is thinking about how you can find common ground. And the best sort of example of that that we've seen is citizens' juries, where you try and find commonality around particular policy answers or actions and so forth. You don't worry about everyone having the same values, but you find something that everyone can sort of sign up to. And it's done through a dialogue of sharing knowledge, et cetera, because if most people are asked, would they prefer a fish or a car? They have no idea why one would bother with a fish. And of course, there's a lot of complex backstory to get people thinking about that. So, and environmental justice organizations also feel that need for developing consensus and collaboration and hearing each other and not shooting people is a good idea. The next bit is about green markets, basically, nature markets. And again, environmental economists tend to support markets, commodifying carbon credits, biodiversity credits, so they can be traded, so they provide incentives to encourage people to do the right thing. And pragmatists tend to support that. They feel that that will bring in extra funding because you're basically creating a sort of type of business, an eco-entrepreneur, if you like, who will say, well, I'll create some greenery here that will count a certain amount of units. You invest in me, I'll create a return. So you're using a sort of business model basically to regenerate the environment. Ecologists, ecological ecologists will say, wait on, ecosystems are called systems for a reason. And a lot of research is that all the value in ecosystems is around networks, connection, and so forth. So if you try and commodify them, you basically break them into bits. You just, you can't do that. It just makes no sense. You're also putting something into the hands of incentives and so forth. So people are incentivized to oversell nature-based solutions to get more money into it. Private finance anyway finds it very difficult to invest in this sort of stuff. It's too complicated, it's too small. They want to take 1% out of billions. They don't want to have to invest in a project which is uncertain, complex, involves lots of people they have no skills in. It's crazy. So investment won't happen. And of course, this underpins greenwashing. So people can get little badges that say carbon neutral. People can say in the north, right, we'll keep going and go and just green the south, which could well mean moving people out, stopping them growing. So green colonialism could be a key bit. And ultimately, a lot of them are offsetting schemes, which just make sure you don't get worse. And given that we're in a crisis, that obviously the statements we need to recover, etc., green markets aren't going to do that either. What they're looking for is more radical institutional change, collaboration, and it's interesting that actually the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology are currently doing research into the potential of collaborative governance arrangements, this is in the UK, for land management. And that's the sort of thing that's much more in the space. Lastly, food. What does this all mean for food? So people will be aware that obviously growing food depends on the environment. It's all grown in soil, not all of it quite, but nature is a key input, and we're losing it. And also, of course, climate change is undermining the resilience of our food systems. So how we protect nature is obviously crucial to that. Now, again, environmental economists, and again, for my panel members, this is simplifying things, but it's all about getting the incentives right, internalizing the costs along the supply chain, and so on. And pragmatists will be up with that, but more focused on, is it actually going to deliver in terms of environmental outcomes rather than getting the price right? Ecological economists will look more at systems change, institutional change. So take the food supply chain. From a view of environmental economics, it's supply and demand. You change the incentives, you get the results. From an ecological economics viewpoint, it's a set of contractual or non-contractual relationships with huge power inequalities where certain people, certain organizations are gatekeepers and can shape outcomes much more than others, who externalize risks on other players, and particularly in the global south. And so you're coming at the starting point, coming from just a totally different starting point. At the end of the day, it's incentives for environmental economists and environmental pragmatists. It's institutions in the widest sense for ecological economists and environmental justice organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. That was a lot to summarize. So yes, well done and thank you. So I guess my question to you is whether you feel that, Henry did point out right at the beginning that he was creating sort of caricatures or stereotypes, but do you feel that Henry has broadly, accurately summarized the different approaches to thinking about nature's value and the role of markets? Would you add anything? And I guess moving on from that, what would be, and what indeed are the implications of taking any one of those approaches through to its logical conclusion for the future of the food system? So answer that as you like, and who would like to kind of pitch in first?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. So, no, I think, Henry, you've done, I really enjoyed reading the paper. I think you summarised that very well. There is a lot in that paper. I have to say, I mean, I did my master's in ecological economics, and reflecting on your paper, I think most of what I learned was environmental economics. And there's a few modules. The core module is all about critiquing it and looking at some of the more social aspects of the limitations of the current economic model or neoclassical. However, all the applied stuff, all the methodologies, everything was environmental economics, as you describe it. So, I actively sought out that master's degree because I was like, I like the concepts being explored around the circular economy and all those kind of things. But I have to say, in practice, environmental economics still even dominates those fields. And I think some of that is because it's actually very difficult to apply some of the concepts in ecological economics in the real world, where organizations and institutes are structured in very siloed ways of thinking. We have our certain remits that we cover, and therefore, we need a nice, tidy way to conduct appraisals and evaluations, whether that's government or private organizations. And so in my professional career, I found a lot of what we end up having to engage with are environmental economic techniques. It's all centered around that. A lot of the dialogue is around that. However, a lot of the resistance that we're facing in a lot of the working groups that are looking at how to make nature markets work in agriculture in the UK, for example, a lot of the issues that are arising from that are all about governance and social structures and equity issues about how these transactions will be carried out, and how will the farmers on the ground be able to preserve their rights and their control over these agreements, and where are the bottlenecks in the value chain which could actually take advantage of these agreements and have disproportionate power. So actually a lot of those concepts that were explored in ecological economics tend to play out, even though the foundation, the starting point is environmental economics as kind of the bit that brings everyone together in the first place.
Can you just say a bit more about those debates that are playing out? A bit more detail.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, there's at the moment, there's work. So, just as a reminder, I work for the National Farmers Union. At the moment in the UK, particularly post-Brexit, we've seen a huge historical transition in the way the sector is being supported. So there's been a big shift away from direct subsidies towards the sector, more of a focus on environmental-based support or payments from government. There's an increasing appetite from policymakers to leverage private finance to meet some of the statutory environmental targets that the government has set itself. So there's a big push towards private markets, whether that be carbon offsets, biodiversity offsets, water agreements, those kind of things. And there's been a big push to try and get demand going. but there's actually huge barriers still on the supply side. So there was always this working assumption that, go back 4 years, 5 years ago, there was a huge assumption that if the demand side is there and government can make corporates demand these things, the supply side will follow because the money is there. But what we're finding over time is that the supply side isn't ready to engage in these agreements because the capacity isn't there on the ground. There's too much risk, for a farmer who's facing off into short-term market incentives from the supply chain. So the food system, they're looking at very volatile global commodity prices, and therefore they need flexibility in how they manage their land. Whereas what these private markets are trying to do is lock in agreements of 30 years, 80 years, 120 years. They want scale to drive down transaction costs, as Henry talked about. And so a lot of the small and medium-sized farmers, the tenant farmers, have no way to actually engage in these private market initiatives. And there's just such a gulf between what the demand side wants, which is high levels of permanence in what's being delivered on the ground, quite rigid requirements, and a lot of the risk being on the supply side. So the farmer has to deliver. And what the farmer wants, which is actually, we don't want 80-year agreements because that will affect my kids and my grandkids and my ability to manage my asset. What they want is 3 to 5 year agreements because they want that flexibility to be able to adapt to a global market where all these free trade deals are being done and they're going to have to compete against Australia, New Zealand, the US, or whoever. And in this very fluid policy landscape we're in, farmers aren't ready to commit to those long-term agreements. And so the risk doesn't match up to the social pressures that farmers are feeling on the ground, aren't really reflected in the discount rates that are used in these environmental markets, or just in many of the considerations around some of the social constraints. There's a big aspiration for farmers to collaborate and produce cluster farms and have cooperatives. But actually in the UK, we don't have a strong history of that. In UK farmers we don't have a lot of cooperatives and producer organizations. Some of these concepts of collaboration are quite foreign to how a lot of farmers in the UK operate. There's other examples in the continent where you do see stronger examples of collaboration and cooperatives playing a stronger role in the value chain, not necessarily in the UK. And it's a real challenge to understand how we overcome that, to create those social relationships between farming businesses so they can kind of collaborate in a supply chain that's actually incentivized them not to do so till date. So.
Thank you. Connie, does any of that resonate with you from your work at an international level? And do you want to make some kind of broader reflection of the overall thrust of what Henry's been saying as well?
Oh, sure, absolutely. And I also agree. It was an excellent summary of the debates. And I like the way you highlight how all of this really is so political. And I would add, I think also drawing on something Rohit was saying, that there are a lot of vested interests in the current system that have a lot of major implications for equity, meaning who benefits and who loses from them, that we need to understand. And so if we start to consider these questions, putting things like equity and accountability more centrally into our thinking, then we could ask questions about how can we create systems that are accountable to particular places and people that depend on them. So this idea of a place-based approach to thinking about the problem runs absolutely counter to commodification, sort of fundamentally, which is about fungibility and how you can exchange one piece of wetland in the UK is the same as in Ghana or anywhere else. But yet you could argue this is kind of critical in terms of the accountability question, because unless we have enough sort of reasonably equal distribution of power and resources to allow people to push back on unsustainable practices, where are we going to be at? So I think at a very fundamental level, if we don't think about that question of, how do we empower people that are affected and also interested in particular places, look what can happen politically. I mean, well, we're seeing it already in many ways internationally. But another point that I think the explainer didn't necessarily get into, but I wanted to mention, was this issue of speed and scale. because you hear that argument, especially on the kind of commodity side or the environmental economic side, that, well, you know, carbon and biodiversity markets, this idea of commodifying nature may not be a perfect solution, but we need it because we cannot achieve what we're trying to achieve in terms of addressing climate change and deforestation and these big problems unless we generate massive amounts of private finance. But what I think is so interesting, firstly, is that, and that's usually actually argued against sort of any other approach, because we do see these instruments, these sort of commodification instruments, becoming more and more dominant in a lot of different countries and also internationally in terms of international agreements. What's so interesting, though, is they make really big promises about speed and scale, but let's see where we've gotten so far. I mean, forest carbon markets are relatively well developed, have been around for, you know, even decades now, and we're not seeing the promises being fulfilled. And yet now we're talking about biodiversity credits, which are even more complex and arguably harder to implement. And now that's going to be the new solution. So I also think there's a bit of, you know, it's maybe the logic of trying to attract, you know, attention and get people to invest is to inflate the promises of speed and scale. But I think, what if we thought about speed and time and scale a little bit differently? What if we thought about what is actually durable? What if we look to examples where people have been, you know, even protecting areas for decades or centuries or even millennia, and try to learn something from these other sorts of approaches? Because, you know, you want speed. Well, markets also tend to be extremely volatile, as I think came up there as well. So, you know, maybe a certain amount of less speed, more balanced durability might be something we really need to consider. And also, instead of thinking in terms of scale about scaling up, so you come up with one solution, whether it's a carbon market, a biodiversity market, and then say, how do we scale this out really quickly? Scale up really quickly so that we can use it everywhere. What about scaling out? I really like that expression, scaling out, which is more about horizontal learning between different context, place-based approaches that different communities of many different kinds are trying around the world. I mean, now we can also use technologies to communicate with each other and sort of learn from each other without imposing a one-size-fits-all solution. So I think, yeah, why don't we rethink what we need in terms of scale and also in terms of speed and what that might look like.
Thank you. Vasilius, I mean, you at WWF, you're trying to engage with this whole question of nature markets and carbon markets, aren't you? I mean, how do you navigate these issues as an organization?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much, Henry, for this summary. Yeah, I'm not working on WWF's work on carbon and nature markets. And I think our work is very varied. So we definitely see in everyday life the intrinsic value of nature. So what would be more valuable to children who, for instance, donate money through their schools for the restoration of nature, people donating money for jaguars to be conserved, even though they'll never see them again. But also we've quite mainstream in the sense that we're involved in setting up nature and carbon markets, regulation on disclosures from governments and businesses, and so on, which is something that will fall more in the camp of environmental economics. And in fact, I'm not very well versed in the topics of, I don't know, epistemology or taxonomy of economists within this movement. So until now, I identify myself as an environmental economist. I don't know if I'll still keep doing this after reading your paper, Henry. And I think this is relevant. So I don't know if I'm getting into a dangerous place now in terms of what's allowed or not. But the way I see this work we do in environmental economics, especially within WWF, I can see I don't think the two approaches are necessarily mutually exclusive. Like, we do a lot of work that relies a lot on valuing nature, and I'll explain in a minute what this means, as well as on sort of accepting some more intrinsic values on nature, focusing on institutions and distributional effects. I know there's an argument in your paper, Henry, that says that, you know, just by trying to measure the value of nature and basing your policy on this, you immediately undermines some of the values we're trying to protect in nature. So maybe they are mutually exclusive, I'm not sure. But the way we're approaching this, I don't see them as being mutually exclusive. And I cannot agree more with what both of you said, Connie and Rohit, on, I think we already see a lot of the limitation of neoclassical economics within environmental policy. I think one very strong example is carbon pricing. Like we spent 20 years debating what the right price for carbon should be, only to realize 20 years ago that actually nothing changes, even if we set the price right. If it could be too low, it could be too high, it's still not much will change, because it's not the price of carbon that will drive change. It's the specific barriers that different stakeholders face with decarbonizing that we need to focus on. So for instance, we set a price on carbon here in the UK and in the European Union, but it was some sectors that find it harder to decarbonize that needed specific incentives. There are some communities or groups of people that couldn't transition, so they needed bespoke support to do it. And now we see the same happening also in nature, where all of the focus keeps falling on ways of measuring nature. And like there's this constant sentence that's being used for nature that, oh, nature is more complex than climate, that's why it's so much more difficult, which of course it is, and won't get much simpler. And I think there's a big movement of people trying to find 5 metrics to define nature, which would cover land, it would cover pollution, it would cover migration, connectedness, like all these metrics. And I think it's impossible to do. Whereas in reality, what I see in my work a lot, it's exactly what you described, Rohit, is that what stops banks from investing in, for instance, regenerative agriculture, what stops farmers from investing in it, it isn't necessarily the fact that we haven't valued nature appropriately, or we haven't found the right way to measure progress and baseline it. It's more the fact that we are asking currently farmers to take a massive leap of faith to transition to a new model that we don't know how to define, we don't know how to measure, and we're asking them to do this and do a lot of learning by doing and take this huge risk so that we as a society can decrease our impact on nature. Whereas what the focus should be more on is how we distribute this cost that's currently placed on farmers across the supply chains, and so that the stakeholders hold most of the profits, can absorb the risks that currently fall on some stakeholders that don't have the capacity to absorb them. And I think this is relevant in this. So I think my first question really is it, if we, for instance, use a mixture of methods where in some cases, it's necessary for us to use values of nature. Because if I walk into a room with policymakers and we even use green growth metrics, or not even like mainstream GDP metrics, and we tell them, oh, look, we'll create 50,000 jobs in this area if we do this, or we'll create so much more health benefits for people, which results in so much savings in the NHS. This doesn't move the dial. Currently we're in a place where the current government is really focused on economic growth. So every single argument and benefit I want to articulate in terms of nature has to be relevant to UK's GDP strategy. So it's very, very limiting, and it's really hard to use any other metrics. So I think in these contexts, for us to move the dial, we have to speak the language that policymakers do. Otherwise, it'll be really hard to get any messages across. However, at the same time, I think it is quite well known that the distributional effects of this transition are not captured currently in measures of GDP or unemployment. And this is, I think, where a lot of the ecological economics come in, which, again, I agree 100%. I did a degree in environmental economics, and it was all neoclassical, nothing on ecological economics. I didn't know about many of the distinctions until I read your paper, Henry. But yeah, this is more broadly how I see it.
Thanks, Vasilis. And what you've done really well is articulate an environmental pragmatist position, which is a kind of, what is the alternative in a very, very tough policy and economic climate? And of course, the obvious question of like, how does change get paid for? So I'm just sort of posing the question.
Shall I come back and
Go for it, yeah.
I think we can learn a lot from work on innovation strategies. And one of the sort of starting points of innovation strategies, you have to accept that the mainstream institutions, decision making, et cetera, is all sort of intertwined with the status quo. So if you go straight up to the status quo and say, no, we should be thinking totally differently because we're missing out this and that, you'll get absolutely nowhere, right? And the key idea, I think, in innovation strategies is the idea of finding niches where you can explore and experiment and bring people on board to a different way of doing things. And actually, you could argue that this, we've talked about the contrast between place-based approaches and national markets, international, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, place is a niche. In fact, every place is its own niche, I suppose. So in a way, you could argue it suits in terms of trying to develop different ideas and so forth. However, of course, even if you are in a place, etc., or you've got local government who use certain ways of seeing things, the mainstream also obviously goes down to place as well. But I suppose the key thing is to find people who are of similar mind, and the key thing, I think, is to be solving problems. It may not be the economic growth problem, but for instance, local nature recovery strategies. I'm talking very UK here, and I have to admit that my knowledge of institutions in other countries is pretty limited. So for an international audience, I'm afraid this is quite niche maybe for you, but our local institutions have all spent the last 3 years developing a strategy to recover nature at a local level. The problem is that they have no power to deliver it. So that's every problem is an opportunity. And yet, so actually, because the local organizations, the county councils, have no money and no power, that actually is an opportunity, because it means that it requires collaboration. It actually, to solve that problem, they actually have to work with other people. And once you have to work with other people, you also have to create collaboration structures that the other interests and possibilities will accept, which requires a level of dispersal of power. Now, of course, it can create a new cartel of people that then do in the others. But the one thing, I mean, I am working with Hertfordshire County Council, and they want to create a multi-stakeholder structure, and they want citizens in Hertfordshire to be part of that. And that also allows you to bring in citizen science. Another problem they have is no way of monitoring, no resources to monitor. So again, that is a problem that creates an opportunity, because it then creates a rationale for getting people on board who then have a voice. And so when the farmer says, get off my land, actually they now say, well, get on my land, actually, because you can help me monitor environmental outcomes, which then can prove that there are resources and so on. So it may be that at a national level, when you're talking, you get the mainstream view, et cetera, but I think you have to then go down into the reeds, into the, and look at what actually the other problems are, and what, and how you can actually create change that solves problems that other people see and means that they're willing to get on board. The farmers think, well, I'm not going to sell my credits. I want to work with other people, and maybe the county council will be the front for Hertfordshire green opportunities, which is much more realistic, and they'll have some capacity to actually help farmers, so the SMEs and so forth. So you can find, I think, solutions. This is a very English example, but there may be other examples where you can create common cause of a range of different people who see opportunities in working together, because that's basically it. People have to see and be willing, and at least enough resource to get them round to create agreements to actually do things in a collaborative manner.
Just on that, I guess one of the big challenges we find is around this whole sharing versus land sparing debate, which is effectively, with a lot of these markets, what they will ultimately do is displace agricultural production to some extent. So woodland, peatland restoration, a lot of other things you're looking to do would generally displace food production, and is very, as you say, it's very place-based. So there will be opportunities for some farmers out there to engage in these markets where there might be a local manufacturer or water company that are interested. But what we're finding is it's so context specific and it's so niche that it's actually only a very small opportunity for farmers out there. When we're looking at the scalable opportunities, how do we get scale on environmental delivery across farming systems? That's where really the insetting and the embedding it through the supply chain side comes into play, which is effectively how do we align the food producing incentives with sustainability incentives, rather than both of them being at odds with each other at the moment, which is what we're finding. And that's where on the collaboration point, we do think there's a lot more opportunity for collaboration across the supply chain. So there's, for example, DEFRA have set up a food data transparency partnership project, which is looking to bring actors from across the supply chain together to figure out the whole data issue. and say, well, actually, how do you measure these things in a way that farmers can deliver, demonstrate the outcomes, and in a way that supply chain actually find useful to meet their disclosure requirements and that kind of stuff. But those conversations are useful. They're helpful in building trust and broader capacity in the food system to try and tackle these issues. The challenges we find sometimes in some of these discussions is that there's not enough of the food chain represented. You will have certain organizations that are kind of further along in the journey who are happy to engage and kind of put themselves out there, but you'll get a whole load of organizations that don't want to be seen anywhere near it at the moment and are happy to kind of watch from the side. And it's always how do we expand that collaboration piece so more organizations across supply chain feel happy to tackle some of the thorny issues, because otherwise what we do get is we get the same examples all the time of the success stories. You hear about, these 3 or 4 kind of projects that are seen as like a huge success, and look how they regenerated there. But when you dig into it and you look at the background of their motivations, and you tend to find their circumstances are quite unique, right? They've either got favorable supply chain agreements into some premiumized market. They might have favorable financing terms, or the size of an estate that they can implement some of this on. They might have a diversified business like tourism, which benefits from the nature-based solution being on their land. There's all these kind of factors that come into play, which then when we start thinking about how do we scale some of these solutions, you chip away and you go, actually, most farmers aren't in that position. They don't have the luxury of some of these conditions to be able to engage in the same way, in which case those same success stories we hear about time and time again, these this water company intervention or this regenerative agriculture project in this area or whatever, seem increasingly out of touch with the reality of most farmers out there. So it's just a word of caution that we can look at some of these pioneers and think, oh, we can replicate this, but in practice there's a lot of reasons why we can't, and we need to understand those reasons a lot better.
Yeah, the death by case study,
Yeah.
by recirculated case study is very, very familiar. But Connie, do you have any examples from perhaps overseas that you might want to share?
Well, I mean, so following up on the question about how do you finance nature recovery, you mean, or sustainable food systems? I mean, because is that
Yeah, I mean there is, Henry, you were saying a problem can become an opportunity, but problem can remain a problem. I mean, things do need to be paid for. So how does that happen?
Yes, I mean, may not be the answer that you're looking for necessarily, but I do think what's not explored enough is what kind of costly solutions are we proposing? Because I think a lot of the sort of estimates of how much it'll cost, for example, to save biodiversity are based on a particular model of how we're going to do this. And one thing that I think isn't done nearly enough is somehow learning from not just some new bright idea in some case study area, but from existing systems all over the place that maybe are doing a relatively good job, of protecting nature. For example, I mean, in Ghana, cocoa farming communities, I mean, some of them actually, in some communities, they're already doing a fairly good job of, agroforestry when they're in their cocoa farms. There's not really much deforestation going on. They're keeping trees on their farms already without any interference. So we could approach that situation and say, how can we support, but they're facing threats from mining and other and international, initiatives to make them more sustainable that are also stressing them. So, I mean, I think, how can we look at what is already working, models of all different kinds, because every situation is going to be different, and then figure out how to support those at really relatively minimal cost? Because as soon as you start talking about the other thing about this idea of we need 30 billion in the next few years is, since when has society been able to manage, even if that money were to flow, to find it in the right hands? I mean, and any sort of argument that we need to generate that kind of billions and billions of finance so quickly is just highly problematic in so many ways. So I think, rather than I have heard of interesting networks, horizontal learning schemes, et cetera, but rather than point to any one particular case, I think we need to spend a lot more time looking at and paying attention to what's going on the ground. I mean, here in Oxfordshire, there's so much already happening pre-local nature recovery plan that isn't being recognized, and oftentimes is kind of just railroaded right over with a development or something because it doesn't register. It's not, so I guess I would look at it that way too.
Yeah, I'm not usually the person that's a pro-markets one, but in this panel somehow I'll become one now. I agree with everything you said. I think, and this 20 billion stat per year, it's the most ridiculous one. The other one I hate is the one that 50% of the economy is highly or moderately dependent on nature, whereas the other 50 somehow isn't. But yeah, these are the stats I think every other paper is referencing. So I 100% agree with the comments you made. Just to answer your question on examples, there is a really strong example that we currently are loosely involved in, which is the Tropical Forest Forever facility that the Brazil government and Colombia are championing, which is the notion of this is that every 2 years there's an international agreement saying that developing economies will give money to developed economies. Developed economies will give money to developing economies that are nature rich to restore nature, and the targets are never delivered. There's never enough of the financing making it to the developing economies. So this time Brazil and Colombia are championing a new mechanism called the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, TFFF, where they'll be in charge of holding deforestation in countries that were in their own countries, but also they're engaged countries with tropical forests. And developing countries will be paying money as a payment for ecosystem service for perpetually on an annual basis to stop the degradation of forests in these countries. And if they don't hit their targets, so if, for instance, for some reason they fail to manage deforestation, then this money will stop. So this is a concept of it. And this falls definitely in the environmental economics category in your paper, Henry, where there's a very elaborate model to calculate how much money needs to be paid to stop the deforestation in an acre of land. And we can go into the details of whether this model captures this accurately or not. But essentially what it does, it signifies a commitment of that government to say that this is how much we need to stop deforestation in a country. And if they can stop deforestation in 10,000 acres a day, which is the current rate of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon, then maybe this is a good enough value to go with. And at the same time, of course, I accept your premise that there's an issue if we follow this logic, then how do we make sure the money lands in the right place? So I think this facility includes a clause that 20% of the revenue will be going to indigenous people and local communities. We can argue to what extent this delivers change, but I think to deliver the change at the scale necessary, I think this is an example of what we see working quite well. It hasn't been developed yet. I think it's going to be voted in at COP30. So I don't know what the outcome of this is, but I think similarly with REDD Plus or I know that, for instance, there's a lot of research out there on how carbon markets have failed because they overestimate the opportunity cost of cutting down forests in a way to appreciate the value of whatever services they provide. And they have failed miserably to stop carbon emissions and to deliver what they have been claiming. Equally, there are many REDD Plus projects that have failed. But at the same time, there are many examples of REDD Plus projects where money has gone to local communities and carbon emissions have decreased in response to these projects being delivered. So I think my approach is I'm not as pessimistic about market-based solutions working as long as they design more effectively, and hopefully this initiative led by developing countries could deliver that adequately.
Go for it. Yeah.
I guess just to clarify on from the farmers' perspective, what we see on the ground is actually they're very for this opportunity. We're being asked. It's not really seen as time and time again, members are saying, NFU members, farmers on the ground, we're a membership organisation, how do we get involved? How do we tap into this income stream? This could be a really good way to deliver environmental outcomes and diversify my income and reduce the risk of my farming business and exposure to volatile commodity markets, for example, and all those kind of things. So it's a really strange area where there seems to be a lot of appetite from everyone involved, from the supply side. Farmers are really keen, well, actually, I'm not sure buyers are that keen because I've been in some buyer roundtables where they say there's literally no incentive for us to be doing this. We're too worried about greenwashing, so we're just not going to touch this because of the lessons from REDD Plus and all those kind of things. But generally, what we're finding is a little bit is that because to make these markets as robust as the advocates would like them to be on, say, permanence and additionality, and to make sure you get those results on the ground, and to try and make them as fungible as possible, so you can trade them and have secondary markets and all that type of stuff. The barriers are really high to investment or engagement. So there was almost, there's an issue that when you're trying to deliver multifunctional land use, there's always going to be risks around permanence. And in order to manage some of those risks, you're going to need a high degree of collaboration between the buyer and the seller, which therefore takes away the fungibility side of things. You basically, both sides need to be very invested in that project. And that's what's causing some of the problems at the moment, that the way these markets are trying to be designed is that they have lots of liquidity and fluidity in them, whereas actually in practice, the ones that are seeing some progress are the ones where both sides are the buy side and the sell side are very invested in the interventions that are happening in that particular parcel of land. So almost need more of that, really.
So in a sense, ones that are less market-like.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Recognizing this is not like other markets, and
Yeah.
you can't treat it like other markets.
I'm aware that we need to move on to some questions. Connie, do you have any final comments you want to make before I move on to questions?
Sure. I mean, yeah, it is interesting to hear how, I mean, from an international perspective, and thinking about, I don't know if people are familiar with REDD+, but it's an initiative within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, basically the climate convention, around the basic idea, I think, as Vasilis was saying, is that developed countries would pay developing countries to stop deforesting. That it's not fair to expect them, because, we've already deforested in the global north. In order to develop, expand our agriculture, grow our economies, we can't expect people in the global south to do this without compensation, because the problem of climate change has largely been driven for a long time by the global north. So the idea of REDD+ is very logical. And I think the idea you laid out, Vasilis, is logical too, but it sounds very similar to the logic of REDD+. And what we saw over the years, now over the last couple decades of trying to implement REDD+, is something that sounds so simple, almost because it's so simple, has become about the most complicated instrument you can see. And one of the reasons might be why we see the deforestation in the first place is that, you're trying to sort of commodify a landscape that is not part of a global capital system. The governance doesn't work that way, and maybe shouldn't work that way, arguably, and certainly not for the purpose of servicing to make financiers have get a better investment out of, whatever tropical forest you're talking about. They need to have governance systems that suit their own populations, their own context. So you can't just expect, let's throw a lot of money at it and suddenly governments are going to transform into, Germany or some other model. It's just not a holistic way of looking at why we see these problems in these countries in the first place. So I think, again, I guess I would come back in terms of final reflections that, I don't think there's any way around trying to think, when we think about ways forward, these questions of equity, which everybody, whether they say it out loud or not, is concerned about, because that's how societies get along, is talking about what's fair, what's a right approach, but also accountability. So, in a world where, finance can flit all over the globe and does not have any accountability to any one place, I think that's a fundamental problem in terms of how we're going to harness the very, I think, common and widely spread concern that a lot of average person has around what happens to this planet if given a chance, and if sort of different local concerns were taken into account. I think we could find that within sort of the resources we already have, we can do so much than we're giving ourselves credit for. But it needs to be more of an approach of listening, of collaboration, of taking diverse approaches in different contexts that make sense given their governance situation as it currently stands, and not this sort of magical solution of we just throw enough billions at it, at the one issue that we think is most important. Then that's the other problem. For a lot of countries right now, the deforestation is not their biggest concern, and you can't really blame them. So, and furthermore, even if you get, let's say Brazil does a wonderful job, and, again, the deforestation plummets like it did at one point. Another person gets into power, you know, boom, back it goes up again. So I think we really need to think about how to ground these solutions in a larger population of people benefiting from them, and then they maybe have some more chance of being durable.
Thank you. So resilience, we've been at a workshop today on resilience. So now I'm going to open up to questions. I think there's going to be a mic going round. So does anyone have a question? I'm also going to take any that are online.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions, if that's okay. One for Rohit and one for Celius. So Rohit, you talked a bit about how even when there's demand side, that the supply is kind of hard from farmers, and that one of the reasons is because there's quite a bit of risk that they might get locked into this really long contract when there might be highly fluctuating commodity markets, and perhaps they could get a better price for what they could produce on their land from the commodity market, and they'd rather sell into that, which then actually sounds like farmers would prefer to play the market rather than get locked into a large long-term contract. And therefore the risk is actually what they might lose from higher prices. So then it's really the opportunity cost. So I just wanted to understand if I was understanding that correctly on where farmers see the risk and what they actually stand to lose from getting into a long-term contract. If that's what you meant, that's my first question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's different types of risk. I guess if you go into a long-term 80-year contract with a water company or some other counterparty that you're selling into, there's counterparty risk there. There's obligations that you need to deliver, and in the context of things like climate change and actually uncertainty around how you demonstrate those outcomes. So what are the metrics you use to measure and demonstrate you're delivering what you've committed to deliver? There's a perceived risk around the lack of control over delivering those outcomes. You're effectively relying on a lot of outside advice to help you understand how to deliver those habitats or those ecosystems, and you're relying on that advice to hope that materializes into the quantity of outcomes that can be transformed into credits in the future. There's a lag, because you're effectively got this period of huge establishment costs in those projects for nature in the beginning, and then hopefully as credits materialize in the future, say when the carbon is verified as being sequestered, the trees have grown or whatever, you start getting payments through, and all these things factoring different types of risks like liquidity risk. But at the same time, a lot of farmers identify culturally quite strongly as being farmers on the land, so they want to be producing food. That's something they understand. That's something they can control to some extent. Yes, there's exposure to the markets, but they value the flexibility of being able to respond to those markets from their land and apply their knowledge. And if you can diversify, so at the moment, farmers historically have got involved in government 5-year schemes, environmental schemes, for example, and use that as part of their production system or incorporated practices into their production system. And they're more comfortable with that approach because there's no inherent tension with the business model that they've always had. Whereas nature markets, which usually require quite a large scale intervention on a farm, require a fundamental rethink of risk, structure, how you farm. Effectively, a chunk of your farm is no longer going to be a farm, and you kind of have to accept that. And that's quite a difficult concept for farmers to accept, that actually they will lose control over a significant chunk of their land, even if there's payments coming in for that in the future, maybe 10 years down the line. That these kind of things make it really incompatible with the reality of farm businesses. I mean, the vast majority of farmer businesses are micro businesses, where household finances, farm finances, the business is very much incorporated into the family structure, the household structure, and therefore it's very difficult to untangle both of those from one another. And this is where the intergenerational bit comes in quite a lot, and why there's sometimes aversion to long-term agreements that are going to span multiple generations, because they don't want to lock in their successors into agreements which might mean they can't take advantage of markets in the future when they improve in their robustness, they're more accepted, there's better returns on offer, all that type of stuff. So there's just loads of social barriers at the moment to engagement with these markets.
Thanks. That's very helpful. For Vasilia, this kind of sets up my next question nicely, which is that you mentioned the scale of transformation for some of these farmers, and that really what these tried to do is get farmers to stop being farmers and start being land managers, and essentially then collecting rents on that land, which, I'm not a neoclassical economist, but I generally understand collecting rents to be kind of like a drain on economic welfare. But yet that's something we're essentially asking farmers to do. And if there's a big struggle with kind of an identity shift among farmers, and also kind of whether there is concern about essentially paying for something to happen that nobody previously was getting paid to do.
Yeah, I don't think it's rent, because most of these schemes are set up in a way that they provide a specific benefit in compensation for the payment they're receiving. So, for instance, there is markets where they plant specific plants that would absorb some of the nutrients that otherwise would have ended up in the water stream, which would be classified as pollution by the water companies, or it would be carbon emissions being absorbed, or it would be offsetting some of the damage that developers are doing. And I think the way I see these markets playing a role is partially in, so for instance, most of the sectors in the UK, agricultural sectors, could become more productive, and in order for us to meet some climate targets, they need to shift some way in which they're producing the food. And this is a costly transition, as I mentioned earlier. It involves a lot of new methods being implemented, which increases the risk that Rohit just mentioned if they were to follow this transition. And the role of markets, the way they could function if there's a long-term strategy, is, for instance, provide some stable income while this transition takes place. For some of the farmers we're working with that have transitioned towards regenerative agriculture, the way they've done it is they've relied on these payments to give them some stable form of income, while their revenue from selling their own produce has dropped because they're suddenly producing less, because they're changing the way in which they operate. So in this sense, I see them as stabilizing the risks they're facing. I think a big issue there is we don't know how a lot of these interactions work. So let's say if a farmer suddenly was to graze their cows more outdoors than them being indoors in a way that will help the regeneration of soil and would improve the welfare of the animal. If they decided to plant, for instance, a specific species of plants to absorb those nutrients I mentioned, but then they discovered down the line that this was incompatible with the regenerative transition they're investing in, then this is a potential risk they're facing, because the science isn't there to tell them what is more optimal. So it's a lot of them testing. So all the farmers, who have transitioned, at least in the UK and in Europe that I know of, are doing it gradually. Sorry, I'm responding to the previous question. So on this question, I think, and that therefore I know in the UK is very careful with how they brand it, that try not to brand it as rent and try to make these payments contingent on specific public benefits being provided by farmers to society. And assuming that we still want farmers to continue to produce food, I think these benefits will account for a small percentage of their income. So I think last year it was the average dairy farm received 10,000 in these environmental schemes payments, where the average income was 100. So we're talking about like 10% payment to cover this benefit from being provided, while the remaining 90 is very productive farms that generate products that we need. So I cannot comment much on the cultural shift. I think Rohit covered it really well.
Thank you.
Just on that, the one point I hear quite often from regenerative farmers who've gone on that journey is that the bit that's often missed in that process is actually the extra time, the labor time, the mental thinking that needs to go into a regenerative system versus more conventional systems. And this is something that's often missed, that actually quite often the ones who embark on the transition to regenerative farming or whatever tend to have a strong value driver to do it. It's not the economics of it. Quite often that ends up being, sometimes for some of them, a useful byproduct, so they find their inputs have dropped and they're getting more resilient soils and all the rest of it. But even when you speak to those guys, they will say my workload has gone up significantly from what I used to do, because now I have to respond to what my land tells me, and I have to adapt my system, and I have to think a lot more proactively about what I'm doing and how I'm using inputs and how I'm using livestock on my land and all that type of stuff. So what you tend to find is quite often is there's this simplified focus on yield, and it's kind of like, well, actually, it's a 5 to 7 year J curve, and your yield will drop, but then it'll bounce back to where it was before, and you'll be good, but you'll have lower input costs. But there's also a personal journey that the farmer goes on in that time, which takes a lot of time, personal time and commitment, which again, this is where advice and support and access to that is such an important part of, it's coming back to that whole environmental economist versus like ecological. There's the social softer stuff that doesn't sometimes get captured in some of the messaging around regen that I think needs to be a bit more prominent.
Well, just as a plug, we have a project on regenerative agriculture underway at the moment, and those are precisely some of the issues that we are exploring. So watch this space. Another question, I think, Colin. Wait, Mike.
Very interested in your comment about the sort of social cost, so on, of changing course. But I wondered if these guys who take up what you're calling regenerative agriculture, agroecology, find as a result that their lives are so much richer, better than they were before when they're just trying to make lots and lots of money. But do you find that? Is that?
Yeah, I guess it's difficult because the cohort that we hear from are often the ones that are bought into the journey, not the ones who quit the journey. So when you go to the conferences and stuff, the people who stand up and talk about it and that you then catch on the sidelines, and honestly, it is quite often similar people. Ones you get to know once you've done the circuit a few times. But yeah, no, they will say, look, it's made my life a lot harder in terms of the workload and all that type stuff, but it is very fulfilling for them. But it's difficult to know if that replicates across the population. I need to speak to more that have quit the journey to understand why they did, to kind of have a more fair assessment of that. So.
Yeah, I think we're definitely in agreement that I think this journey is very difficult, and that farmers, whether they transition or not, need to be more supported. I think the counterfactual here is farmers already quitting the industry because it's unsustainable and unaffordable for them. So I think last year was 5% of farmers that dropped out, and another 10 didn't, dairy farmers, sorry, and another 10 didn't know if they'll stay in business. And this is because input costs are increasing. So you're right, we don't have case studies of farmers for whom the transition has been successful. Equally, we don't study perhaps enough the farmers who are very intensive and have left the industry to study more closely the reasons for doing it. From the ones who have done it, I think at least we also recently published a report with NatWest on this, on the farmers who have transitioned. The reasoning for doing it in most cases, which I think brings a lot of the ecological economics into it, and for some it was the profitability which could increase, but the uncertainty is so high that it's so hard to demonstrate 7 years in the beginning to tell people you'll be profitable if you do exactly these things. In 7 years' time, if you transition your farm and change everything, you'll be profitable. Like I can't make the case. I can model work to prove to them that this could happen, but it's so uncertain. That what usually drives them are the values, as Rohit said. In some cases, a work-life balance, because if you have a farm and you need to milk your cows 4 times a day and you have 1,000 cows, this essentially you don't see your children, and this is what our case studies capture. So transitioning to a farm with fewer of these cows and less intensive regimes, while also being able to absorb some money from nature markets, could give you a better work-life balance. And now, on a final note, which I think it agrees with what Rohit said, no matter, we designed a model to calculate the cost of transitioning. I showed it to like 20 farms in the first month. There wasn't a single farmer. By the way, these are farmers who transitioned. So farmers who did what I tried to model. There wasn't a single farmer who said, oh yeah, this is exactly how I did it. I follow your model the exact same way and we got the outcome. Because every farm was so different. Like you had farms in different areas of the country, farmers who had different breeds of cows, farmers, like for there was a farmer who decided to sell all his cows and import new ones from Ireland. There was another farmer who just bred a new breed of cows that was more durable and more able to graze outdoors. So like there's so many variants and so many ways in which farmers should do it, which I think brings a lot of the points that you mentioned, Connie, that's why it's important to give agency to the people and the actors and not tell them very strictly and specifically, this is what you should be doing, but just provide the support for them to make their own decisions, provided that it's going in a direction that is beneficial for society and nature. And that's what we see a lot of in our modeling.
Just chip in on that. I mean, just on this, we find actually the term regenerative is very loaded in the farming community. There's a lot of farmers who say we are doing a whole bunch because of the principles of regenerative agriculture. There's loads of farmers who are saying we're doing a lot of this stuff on the ground, but I can't label myself as regenerative because we're not doing all of this and we're not complete. And over time, I'm not fully sure why, but the term isn't seen so favorably. It's not it's something that, you know, if I'm standing in a room of farmers and I start talking about regenerative agriculture and X, Y, and Z, I wouldn't have a huge amount of confidence that I'm winning a lot of support in the room, because quite often what we hear is, what does that mean? How does that work on my farm? This is just a concept which is being used for marketing campaigns by food industry. And what does actually regen mean on the ground? You know, and there is, I think that it's going through a real a bit of a reputational issue at the moment, the whole regen stuff, because of some of the marketing that's been put out there, where farmers are saying that's not regenerative, you can't do that regeneratively. How they're saying all of our X, Y, and Z is sourced regeneratively, and they're like, no, that you cannot produce that crop in a purely regenerative way. So work needs to be done on defining some of this stuff and some of the claims around some of these things, if we're going to get confidence from those on the ground that there is real value in doing this. So
I have one question, and then I'll take yours, but this is one question that was pre-submitted by Nicolette Boter, who asks, how might policy and economic decision-making systems nurture the health and vitality of the natural systems on which our food depends? Okay, so asking that question might be more transformative than asking, how should we value nature and food systems? So I'll just repeat that. Asking, how might policy and economic decision-making systems nurture the health and vitality of the natural systems on which our food depends, might be more transformative than asking, how should we value nature and our food system? Can the panel give examples of places, projects, or environmental decision-making contexts where deep socio-ecological transformations have enabled nature's recovery, and what might we learn from the narratives, governance, or institutional arrangements facilitating this? Well, I think I'm asking this question when we've already had a bit of a discussion about the fact that the case study approach is not necessarily always the most illuminating, but I think, Henry, you had your hand up, so.
Yeah, I think for me, what this talks to, that the question how we should value nature assumes a certain framework, that there are necessarily trade-offs, and we have to, and you know, we've got a car here and a fish there, and we decide which is which. And I mean, this sort of relates to the fact that I think if you come at something with a particular framework, it limits or puts you in a certain way of thinking about things that may not be as creative and, you know, actually help you get to solutions, basically. And so if you actually come at it with a different sort of question, you might have a better sort of chance of finding solutions. And it is this, I suppose, this debate about valuation is, we only have it really because of environmental economics and the way it approaches things. So, and I think that is, I mean, I don't know if we've got another question. Let's go.
I mean, value is a word that exists outside the monetary.
It does, but I suppose the way it's become sort of dominant is because of environmental economics and the desire to, you know, it's sort of where people jump to because of the dominance of that. Exactly, people have different values, etc., etc. But you don't talk about how should we value. You talk about how can we talk about our different values and work out a solution that works for, you know, something like that. When you're talking about people's values, whereas how can we value nature gets you the way that immediately into sort of figures and multiplication and so forth, I think.
I suppose it's direct, but I want some information here. We're talking about farmers, but do you distinguish between landowners who are farmers and tenant farmers? Because a hell of a lot of our farmers are tenant farmers, and how they're thinking about the future and how they're going to make money from farming might differ. In particular, I'm interested because we hear a lot in Farmers Weekly or whatever, read a lot about some farmers are saying, well, I'm going to give up, then I'm just going to go, because I can't get any money now through SFI, I'm just going to go more and more intensive, and to hell with, you know, the environment and everything else like that. I need to earn a living. Does that belong to a particular segment farmer?
And Rohit, can I ask that you keep your comments very brief, because I want to allow enough time for sort of wrapping up as well.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, no, so I mean, the majority of the time when we're talking about nature markets, there is a lot of consideration about tenant farmers. I mean, we represent tenant farmers as well, so it's not like just landowners, it's all types of farmers. But there is a recognition that actually a lot of these markets are just really hard for tenant farmers to engage in, because they're long-term agreements with the landowner who has control over the asset. When you look at the average length of a tenancy agreement, you know, you're talking about 7 years or so. They're quite short-term. But what it means is actually that they're fundamentally the tenant can't demonstrate control over the asset and the land long enough to show that they'll be able to do an environmental intervention that can they can monetize. So quite often the way it's shaping up is that landowner would have the agreement with the buyer of the environmental service, and then the landowner would have to have a separate agreement with the tenant who is actually managing the land to deliver the environmental outcomes, to share, effectively profit share the proceeds from that nature market agreement. So, but there's real difficulties here that actually a lot of tenants don't see it as an accessible avenue for them, unless it's to do with reductions of carbon emissions and more directly linked to production. So if they can demonstrate that they're producing more sustainability and sustainably and monetize that, then that's where tenants suddenly have opportunities, and that's what we're trying to understand, if that's stuff that we can realize through the supply chain. So yeah.
Do we have time for one very, very quick question from the online? Yeah.
So we have a question from Lorraine Richin-Stones. Do environmental economists and or ecological economists currently consider the cost shifting which happens in reality? For instance, pollution impacts on public health, with NHS picking up the bill, flooding with councils and insurers picking up the bill of damage to property and infrastructure.
That's a question. Did you all hear that? It was a question about cost shifting.
Pick that up and then provide a sort of
Yeah,
if that's
pick
okay.
it up and make your final reflections, and then we'll go round, same with everyone.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think cost shifting is an issue in environmental economics and ecological economics, because it sort of, I suppose, fits into the numbers thing. And I suppose part of valuation is seeing what costs are being shifted and trying to put it back into the system, if you like, through internalization and things like that. So it does sort of play, though to what extent it's actually picked up and looked at is a matter of probably of the particularities and what the focus is. And I suppose that was where I was going to go in the summary, is that I think the different ways of approaching this creates different foci and assumptions on the sorts of solutions you're looking for. So the big question, I suppose, is when we're looking at particularly at food system transformation so that it is sustainable, et cetera, seems to be whether the simple or the way of looking at things from an environmental economics viewpoint focuses on the right sort of solutions for the problem in hand, and whether its dominance, I suppose, means that other sorts of issues are not played in, like institutional design, et cetera, et cetera. And certainly my experience of the UK was that no one asked are nature markets the right solution? And should we be only, should we only be thinking that? All the debates about them was how they should be implemented so that they work properly, et cetera, et cetera. No one took a step back and said, what exactly is the problem here? Who are the players? What are the institutions, et cetera, et cetera? And what are the different ways of thinking about this? And what, it was assumed to start with that was the solution. And I think the discussion today has shown that all the time, all the issues that we raised actually are sort of in the institutional bag. And if anyone had really thought about it in depth to start with, they wouldn't have really gone down this road. And the problem happens as well is when roads or directions of journey begin to get momentum. A lot of people bought into them, consultants who make lots of money out of them, and et cetera, et cetera. So that you end up having this huge momentum in the wrong direction, which is very difficult to turn around, because then people have to admit they were wrong and actually this wasn't the best way of going about things. And anyway, they have to admit that they didn't know, all those sorts of things. And I think that is a big problem when you start at the beginning with a set of solutions and then try to make the problem fit the solutions, rather than start by understanding the problem and the situation and the context and try to bring to bear a multidisciplinary, different sort of ways of thinking about things to actually come up with solutions that might work over the long term, rather than being, I was really interested in your comment that the things that seem to be working is where there are strong relationships in particular places between individual things. Now, if you'd thought about the problem, you probably have concluded that at the beginning, and you wouldn't have waited till have spent huge amounts of energy, huge amounts of time discovering that.
So just a sort of 30-second final thoughts.
Sure. So I think actually reflecting back to my when I studied ecological economics, and with Basilius being more market orientated, I can see the distinction now of what I learned and what you learned on it. I think there is an element of one thing we did learn, and it has played out actually, is that when Michael Gove came into DEFRA, started talking a lot about natural capital and public payments for public goods and socialized these whole concepts, and they're all really alien at the time. And they sprung up all these working groups and roundtables about nature markets and market data and how do we get environmental measurement right and all this stuff. Well, actually, there has been a lot of benefit in that process. So over the last few years, the dialogue and the process of discovery and of actually understanding how complex this issue is has been really valuable, because actually we started from the early stage of just lots of high level conceptual chat at every working group. Now we're actually in a place where we're really starting to get into the nitty gritty of this is why single outcomes don't work. This is why we need multifunctional land use. And the conversation has become more sophisticated and nuanced as a result of the environmental economists kind of pushing this agenda of markets. Is led to the discovery, which I think ecological economists could then engage with to kind of go, well, actually, okay, now we can play in the social dimensions and the power relationships and all that. So I think there is some complementarity there between the two approaches, even though they seem to be being at odds. When it plays out in practice, actually, it's helping with the narrative. It's helping to move the conversation on sustainability forward. So it's not all bad. I'm trying to end it on a positive note.
Very positive. We're out of time, so you can be.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, because I'm just thinking, well, yes, in a sense, I am going to be positive, but I hope it doesn't mean I have to be positive necessarily about what I have to be positive about. Yeah. Okay. Well, no, because I struggle with, why is this idea of commodifying nature and capital markets, et cetera, nature, capital, et cetera, so fascinating to people? Why is it so addictive? And because having looked at efforts to do this over decades, I say, for, the thrill is gone. It's like, you see how it actually works. And yet I do realize that it's because sounds so simple and so logical. You can explain it at a cocktail party. it has that popular appeal, and then politicians respond to what has a popular appeal. But I really think for me, what the positive and the hope lies with, I mean, I agree. I do think it's good that the conversations are happening, but we still see the same kinds of solutions popping up everywhere. And also the UK thinks it's invented this, which it hasn't. This has been going on for decades already in other places too. So, I mean, it's just, the hope is with what is already working on the ground, and that if we pay more attention to that and work on supporting it and listening, and I think as Henry's saying, keeping our minds open to other things doesn't mean get rid of this idea entirely. It's not going away anyway, but let's just have a broader conversation about what might actually work. I mean, I think that's where the hope really lies. So thanks.
I'll bear that in mind for my next cocktail party.
Thank you. And I'll echo the point that Henry made earlier, that first of all, not only do we not think whether we need markets or not, but also at their best, I think markets are a tiny, tiny proportion of the solution. As mentioned earlier, it's a tiny proportion of the income that farmers rely on. Our global target for markets is, I think, we want to restore 30% of nature. Like, what happens to the remaining 70? And I think this is where our efforts should focus, whether it is following ecological economics or otherwise. And this is also what worries people the most. Like, what farmers are worrying is not how much nature they restore on the farm. It's not a primary concern. The primary concern is potentially going out of business because they rely too much on this artificial fertilizer, which is excessively expensive. Or our primary concern isn't how we're going to minimize the emission of our households, is that we don't pay too much money for electricity bills. And I think this is where markets and the solutions they provide are very minimal. The focus should be on supporting those who need to transition and to decrease their environmental footprint to be able to do so, not only to decrease their own expenses, but also to contribute positively to society. So I guess this is where I see the intersection of environmental and ecological economics.
Thank you very much. So yes, that just remains for me to thank you, Vasilis, Connie, Rohit, Henry, and to all of you for attending. So that's it for now.